All right, now we're going to move on to exercise 2, where we're going to talk about the game loop, which is something we didn't cover very well when we were teaching you Wheel of Fortune game, but it's a lot more important in Flappy Bird. When you're playing a game, you have several things going on. The things are moving on the screen, and things change based on what's happening on the screen. So in Flappy Bird, the bird is moving, it's falling with gravity, it's jumping when you click, the obstacle is moving, and when the bird collides with an obstacle, it reacts and things change. In this case, the game simply ends and restarts. But in a more sophisticated game, you know, bullets are flying, and when they hit their target, then things change. The character dies, for instance. So you have this loop running constantly, that where you go through multiple steps, where you update the state of things, you move a character, or the obstacle moves from right to left. You react to the new state. Now that everything's moved, you see, is anything colliding? Is anything now in a new position that matters? And then you finally draw the results of that to the screen. So the game loop has 3 very specific steps in it, which are update, react, and draw. And we're going to go through how to build a really, not real game, but like an example of this, and that will apply to Flappy Bird once you actually get to working on that. So in exercise 2, which if you load up by changing the URL to ex2 in your project, it'll be blank. There's nothing really in it. And we can look at exercise2.js, and we see that it's the same setup code. We have the setup where it creates the canvas and the draw loop, which is where we'll actually fire the game loop. And I created a game object here. So it's a variable called game, and it's an object. And I'm going to set up my game loop using inside this game object, kind of to keep things organized well. So I'm just going to build something, and then I'll explain how the pieces work as we go. So like I said, there's 3 steps to the game loop. There's update, react, and draw. And so I have the 3 functions here. And just to keep things kind of sane for myself, I'm going to make another function on the game called run. Or maybe I'll call it loop, because that's what it actually is. Let's call it the loop. And all this is going to do is call those 3 functions all at the same time. So the update, react, and draw. So our game loop runs the 3 steps. And in the draw function that P5 uses, we're going to call game.loop. And so every time draw runs, which is roughly 60 times a second, it's going to call game.loop. And this will do nothing because nothing's happening in each of the 3 steps. But let's go ahead and kind of build this up. So let's say our not real game here is going to draw a circle. We'll start with the same circle we had in the other exercise, where it's position 50-50 and height and width of 80. And if we load up the game, it's drawing the circle repeatedly. Actually, you just can't tell that it's doing it repeatedly. So say we want this circle to move across the screen. So that's where the update comes in. And if we have some state, some data like the x position of this circle, we can change the x position on the update step. So if we had a variable called x, we could change that. I'm actually going to assign, put that variable as a property of the game. Say game has an x, so you can call game.x or this.x inside of a game function. And it will start at 0. So it's way over here now. And in the update function, we can change the x value from 0 to something else. So we're using the this and the dot notation to access this property of game, and plus plus adds 1 every time. So every time this is run, which in loop it runs it first, and then react is run, which does nothing, and then finally draw is run. That's just going to happen repeatedly. And if we refresh, we'll see that the circle now moves across the screen. And you'll remember that it has this kind of blurring effect because we're drawing on top of the previous state. So we can actually, in our draw loop, set the background color to white again first. And now it looks like it has the illusion of the circle moving across the screen. So let's have a simple react. Like what do we want to change based on state? After everything updates, we want something to change. And I think the simplest thing we can do is we can just reset the circle back to the left edge when it reaches the right edge. And so we have the X position of the circle, and we know where the right edge is because it's the width of the browser's window. And we can put an if statement in there saying if X is greater than the width of the window, then let's set X back to 0. So this should create kind of a loop where it moves across the screen, and as soon as it reaches the other side, it's going to set back up. And that's kind of how your obstacle will work as well, to create this continuous movement from right to left and then right to left again. So not a very exciting game, but those are the 3 steps: update, react, and draw. Of course, the thing is you have more than just a simple circle in your game. You have the bird, you have the obstacle, you have the ground. There can be multiple elements. As you make the game more complicated, maybe you'll put some decorative elements in there that change or move. So each of these things will have some data about where they are, what they look like this X variable. Each of them will have some way to update themselves. The obstacle will move one way, the bird will move another way. They'll all have different code for drawing. And if you were to put all of this inside the game, it'd kind of be hard. It's like, is this the bird X or the obstacle X, or like which thing is which? So I would actually recommend that every element in the game gets its own object. So I'm going to take the things that are related to the circle, X, the changing the X on the update, the drawing, and I'm going to move that into another object. I'm going to create another section of the code up here. We'll call it circle. Create another object. And I'm going to move 2 of these functions up there, or recreate 2 functions. I'm going to create the update function and the draw function. And I'm going to move this X variable because this is the X of the circle, not the X of the game. The game isn't a visual element, it's an organizational element. I'm going to move the X of the circle and put that in the update function. I'm going to move the drawing of the circle and move that into the update function, the draw function of the circle. And so now when we update, what are we updating? Well, the circle is a variable, holds an object, and we can use dot notation to get to its update function. So instead of the game updating itself, it's going to update the circle. And we can do the same thing in draw over here. So we can do circle.draw. And now these things will get called. And I'm not moving the react function up to circle because react is going to involve multiple elements. It doesn't at this point, but you're going to have the bird reacting to the ground, for instance. And so instead of moving code into the circle, I would want to have the React kind of take care of a bunch of objects at the same time. And I can still have access to them because the circle is an object which has an X property, and I can just change this here to refer to the circle's X instead of the game's X, because the game doesn't have an X property anymore. So this actually shouldn't change anything. I just moved some code around, reorganized it, but it'll have the same effect. When it gets to the edge, the react function will decide, actually I need to move it back to the left side, and it will continue on. So you can have lots of variables with objects with update and draw functions, and they can have different properties for storing their X position, their Y position, the color, all sorts of things that to keep track of what will actually be drawn on the screen. There's one more concept I want to cover here because this game just continues. It starts running and it just continues to run. It never stops. It's the game loop only has one kind of version of it. But when we're looking at Flappy Bird, there's two states that the game is in, at least in the version I made. There's this kind of paused or beginning state where nothing's reacting actually. It's just the bird is kind of floating up and down and it's waiting for some user input, and then things start moving. It's updating the obstacle, the bird's updating changes, it's listening for the clicks, and then it has the react where if anything collides, it changes and reverts back to the original state. So there's kind of a pause state and a playing state. And that is part of the game. The game has these states, and the game should decide when I'm paused, we're going to do one thing, and when we're playing, we're going to do another thing. The way I would set that up is I would actually create a couple of variables here. I'll call this paused variable. It's just going to hold a string. It doesn't really matter what it holds, but this is kind of conventional. Paused variable and a playing variable, and I made them all capitals because that's an indication, like a convention indicating that these are variables where you shouldn't change the value of them. You shouldn't take paused and assign it to playing, the value of playing. That doesn't make much sense. And we're going to start the game in a pause state. So we'll create the game object and give it a property called state, and its value will be paused. And what I want to do is, when I'm updating the circle, I don't want the circle to move while we're paused. I only want the circle to move when we're playing. And so we can tell the circle when you're updating what state the game is in. I can pass in the game state by saying this.state, this inside the function referring to game, and state referring to this property. And so the argument of that I'm passing the update will be the state. And what I can do here is say if state is equal to playing, then let's move the X position. If it's not equal to playing, we don't want to move the X position, so we're just not going to do anything else. There's no if statement here. It's just if we're playing, move. Otherwise, nothing. So when I refresh this, it doesn't move because we're in our pause state. So how do we make it so the game changes to playing? Well, let's do kind of what we're doing for Flappy Bird and say when the mouse is clicked or when someone taps the screen, we want to change the game state. The P5 reference has all the information you need to know about how to handle clicks and taps in this input section here. There's actually a lot of really cool stuff here that wasn't available to you in Khan Academy, but I'm going to use the touch started function to say when you touch the screen, we're going to set the game to playing. We could use clicked, but it actually works out that touch started works with both clicks and taps. So it'll work while we're developing on a computer, and it'll also work on the phone. So to use the input functions, you define a function with the name that's specified in the documentation. So it's called touch started. And then when you click or tap, this function is run. We can test this a little bit by saying testing when it clicks. So come over here, I'll refresh the page, and when I click, it's repeatedly printing out testing in the console here. So when we hit touch started, what we want to do is look at what the game state is and change it from pause to playing. So we can access the game and using the object, and we can get its state property and say, is the game paused? If it is, let's change the state to playing. So refresh the page, we do a little tap, the circle starts updating only when the game is playing. And then it's going to keep going through. And so you could imagine there'd be another condition, like in React, we could say, we could change React actually. Let's, instead of when the circle's X hits the left edge, we set it back, let's actually change the state. Let's go this dot state equals paused. Or we could have lost. We could have another state. It's called pause, where we lost, where we say if the circle reaches the right edge, the game is over. The player lost. But obviously, there's something missing here. How does the player win? But we can change the state to lost. So we tap. The state goes from pause to playing. The game updates. It redraws and it checks. When we got to the right edge, the game state is now lost. And we could have another element that says, in its update, if the game is paused, we're going to draw a you lost screen, for instance. We can also pass in, like say we want to draw something different, we can have the state come into the draw function and say if state equals playing, we fill with black, or if the state is lost, we fill with red, or we fill with white. So now we can draw things multiple times differently based on the state. I forgot to connect this. I'm not passing in an argument yet, so I have to come down here to draw and say when I call circle.draw, I need to pass in the state. So I forgot one step there. So it's pause, so it's white. It's playing, so it's black. And when it gets all the way to the edge of the screen, it will be red. So that's how I would set it up. You're going to have a bunch of different objects that represent different things in your game: the bird, the obstacle, the ground, score, and each will have an update and a draw function. And given the state of the game, they'll decide what to do, how to update themselves or how to draw themselves. And you'll call those update functions in the game itself, and then in the react part of the loop, you'll negotiate, like, this thing is touching this thing, so let's do this, or the game is now over, so let's display this, or whatever. So that's basically how this game loop works, separating out the react, the update, and the draw steps, and breaking out each piece of the game into its own object that can update and draw themselves. So that's about it, and hopefully that makes sense. Definitely ask me any questions if you're confused. Thanks.